Thank you. I'll introduce you briefly so everyone's aware of who we are discussing with at the moment. We have Dr. Sabine Nikolaus with us, the country director for Germany of Boehringer Ingelheim. We also have Lord Karan Villamoria with us, president of the Confederation of British Industry. Welcome. We also have with us Dr. Bernd Ohnesorger, who's the CEO of Siemens Healthineers. And we have with us Dr. Rainer Dulger, who is the president of the Employers Association here in Germany. Welcome to all of you. Glad that you're joining us for this discussion. And Mr. Dulger, I wanted to start with a question to you. What has your association learned on how to make health systems more robust going forward after these last few years of experience that we've all had?
We all got rolled over by this pandemic. And what we noticed is that the authorities who were responsible for the cleanup of this mess were the ones who used to be in the second, third row in our usual, in our daily usual administrations. So all of a sudden they were in command of the whole country. And then we learned, in Germany, for example, the health authorities, they were still communicating with fax machines. So we learned that we didn't do enough for them and that we probably have to improve things for the future. We were lucky because most of the European countries had a strong healthcare system. So this underlined one more time how important it is to have a very strong healthcare system to bring a crisis like this, a pandemic like this, under control. Then we learned we need new concepts, or we need concepts at all for a pandemic like this. We need a European concept as well, because we had to close down borders, which was totally against the European idea, but we had to do it to protect ourselves. So we need new concepts, and for example, we also need strategic investments in Europe to protect ourselves from future pandemics, for example, in public-private partnership or things like this. But we need a better plan for the next pandemic, which will be coming for sure.
Yeah, I think everyone's agreed on that. I'm sure Mr. Ohnesorger will have something to say about fax machines and digitalization of healthcare in Germany. We'll come to that in just a moment. I want to pick up a question with Mr. Villamoria now about what has been learned. You have said that good judgment comes from experience. That's been your experience, certainly. What do you think we have learned on a global level from this pandemic? What good judgment might we build going forward?
Complete that statement. Good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment.
Ah, there you go.
So, yeah. This pandemic came out of the blue. It took the whole world by surprise, and it's the biggest global crisis that we faced in 75 years. And it literally was a global pandemic. No one was untouched by it. And the challenge with these situations is, A, how do you deal with it? And B, what does it actually highlight? Firstly, it highlighted enormous amounts of inequity that exists around the world. I had the privilege to do what Siegfried is doing now. I was the chair of the B7 last year in London as president of the Confederation of British Industry. For me, sadly, it was not like this with people present. It was a completely virtual event. And I will never forget one of our guest speakers, Dr. Ngozi, the head of the WTO, highlighted the inequities. And she said, do you realize that Africa has a population that makes up 17% of the world's population, and yet only has 0.14% of the vaccine manufacturing capability? And we also had Dr. Geeta Gopinath, the chief economist of the IMF. And after the session, she sent me a report. She said, we have produced a report, and this is, remember, in May last year, that if the world gets together and spends $50 billion, we will be able to vaccinate the whole world within a year. Did we do it? No, we did not. Although we've got the COVAX scheme, which is a fantastic scheme, we have not been able to, so that inequity exists in huge amounts. Now, what it also highlighted to me was governments, and to take up the point that has just been made, but governments working on their own. Now, we've got the National Health System in the UK. It's an institution that we love, we respect. We clap them on our doorsteps. We love the NHS. But the NHS could not have done it on its own. And our Prime Minister whatever he has done or not done, one thing he did do, which was fantastic, was in May. The pandemic started, we had our first lockdown on 23rd of March. In May, he appointed a private sector individual, Kate Bingham, a biotech entrepreneur, to head the vaccine task force. And he said, I empower you. You come in, you can have a host of civil servants to work for you. Here's the money, go back vaccines, find vaccines, get them as quickly as possible. I empower you. If there's any problem, you call me directly. I got to know her and I worked with her throughout the pandemic, and I saw that live. If he had not done that, we would not have, within literally from May to the 8th of December, we inoculated our first patient in the United Kingdom. And you had the Pfizer-BioNTech German vaccine that came out first, followed very quickly by the Oxford-AstraZeneca vaccine. That would not have happened if it had been left to the NHS, to government on its own. It happened because of Kate Bingham. She'd backed 6 vaccines. 2 of them came up trumps within months. I can say more, but I'll save this for future comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Vilmoria. Dr. Nicholas, I want to ask you about something we've talked about already on the stage today, which is the need for resilient supply chains. And that, of course, is important in healthcare systems as well. We saw what it meant for PPE and the discussion around onshoring PPE again. So what do you think were the biggest weak spots that were identified in the pandemic and how they can be addressed?
Well, usually the pharmaceutical industry is built around very strong supply chain and resilient supply chains, because this is our core business, to provide the healthcare system securely, safely, and reliantly, in a reliant way, with our medicine. So when the pandemic came upon us, there were 3 issues, I think, which contributed that we had a shortage in some of the drugs. First of all, there were borders not readily accessible to everyone. So some countries closed the borders. In a global supply chain world, this is not beneficial, because then actually the global supply chain cannot work anymore. That was one of the issues. The other issue was, or still is, that around 23% of the APIs, that active ingredients, are sourced, for example, from one single country like China. So that dependency on one location also is not beneficial to resilient supply chain. And the most important one, which we often forget to mention, is that there was a surge in demand for certain pharmaceutical products from now until the next day, basically. And this is not how supply chains can work, because we also rely on reliable forecasts and demand planning. So that was another issue. So I think these 3 factors led to what we have seen in some of the products, but not in all. And I can also assure you that most of the pharmaceutical products were really in a very resilient supply chain and were deliverable in a global system.
Okay. Mr. Ohnesorger, let's talk about another type of resilience. I promised I would come back and ask you about fax machines. We certainly learned that healthcare systems need to be more resilient and, in terms of digitalization. That's something that was a gaping problem here in Germany, certainly, but not just in Germany, really across the world. How can health data and digitalization contribute to that resilience?
First, I need to mention that I'm looking after Europe, Middle East, and Africa, not after the whole world for Siemens Healthineers. It's about 1/3 of the world, but not the whole world. Our CEO, Ben Montag, who shares the same first name, will be tonight, actually, on stage at the TDI. To your question, I mean, first, I'd like to mention it's great that we have this panel, and if there's one good thing about COVID, it is the recognition and the understanding that a functioning, resilient healthcare system and the support of industry to innovate in them is key, and the pandemic has taught us that lesson, and is not a given. Data in this is of particular importance. The exchange of information, the exchange of data, I mean, could have even further accelerated the development of vaccines, the development of tests, and we saw that actually only by jumping over some barriers under special conditions allowed that speed, which we would wish could actually exist in innovation also in non-pandemic seasons. So in this, And let us not forget, I mean, yes, we might now need to learn how to be resilient to the next possible pandemic, but let us not forget that while, unfortunately, COVID has taken millions of lives, at least 10 times more lives were taken at the same time by non-communicable diseases, cancer, or cardiovascular diseases. And in this data-driven innovation, building artificial intelligence systems that help clinicians to make faster diagnosis, treatment decisions, to help increase speed and access to healthcare innovations, also in the developing world, is of great importance to master the next pandemic, still the outgoing this pandemic, but also the next one, and the existing non-communicable diseases that are the main killers in the world.
Sure, the connectivity and sharing of health data has been crucial, as you said. Mr. Durga, if I could come back to you now. Mr. Bilimouri was telling us about the incredible inequity that we have experienced during this pandemic, and that still exists if you look at the percentage of the developing world that is still not vaccinated. Where do you think the biggest failures were there, and how can they be better addressed?
Well, I think if we look at the recent 2 years of the pandemic and do the aftermath, we would come to the result, if we do not help the southern part of the world to get more access and faster access to vaccinations, we would lead ourselves into a prolongation of the pandemic. So we need access to vaccinations, more production capacities, better logistics, and better access also for the southern part of the world to solve those inequities, and also keep the pandemic as short as we can, not give too much room for new variants, new virus variants, and so on. And this can only be achieved that we give worldwide access to vaccinations also to the southern part of the world, more production capacities, more investment. And this all will lead into also better logistics, which is quite a problem at the moment, but these are the lessons learned, what we can do to get rid of those inequalities.
Mr. Bilimouri, I'll pick up on that with two questions. One, we know that those inequities exist. Why do you think they haven't been addressed? I mean, this current pandemic is still ongoing. And secondly, we're talking about the global south in terms of vaccine equity, but what can the global north actually learn from the global south in building more resilient healthcare systems?
Absolutely. One other point to make is it's not just government and business working together. There is another third part of the triangle, and that is academia and universities. And we've seen the enormous power with Oxford University teaming up with AstraZeneca. And of course, AstraZeneca is a Swedish-British firm headquartered in Cambridge. And that was phenomenal to have this affordable vaccine that came from university business collaboration with government backing. And here's the other dimension to it. It's even more powerful if you have cross-border collaboration. And who did they partner with? They chose the Serum Institute of India, owned by the Poonawallas. I come from one of the smallest ethnic minority communities in the world. I'm a Zoroastrian Parsi. There are 100,000 of us in the world. And the Poonawallas are one of those, they're part of this community. And they have, before the pandemic, and the world didn't know this, they were the largest vaccine manufacturers in the world. 2 out of 3 children on this planet are inoculated by the Poonawallas and the Serum Institute of India, and the developed world didn't want to know about their vaccines. It was only in the developing world. He is being nominated for a Nobel Prize for saving, they've calculated, 30 million lives because of providing affordable vaccines before the pandemic. Now the whole world knows about Cyrus Ananda Poonawalla, and he's now the wealthiest pharmaceutical billionaire in the world. And they have produced 2 billion doses of the Oxford AstraZeneca vaccine from a starting scratch. They in fact produced 200 million doses before November, before any of them were approved, before their vaccine was approved. They took the risk and produced 200 million doses at risk, which may have had to be destroyed. So you ask what the developing world and developed world, and what the developed world can learn from the developing world. I challenge you to go and visit that factory which I visited. And I love factories. My business is in brewing with Cobra Beer. I love factories. And we have impressive factories. But I tell you, this is the most impressive factory I've seen in my life. So I think there is huge potential in the cross-border collaboration. Linked to that is also regulation. Medical regulators are known around the world to be very cautious, rightly so, but also very slow. The fastest a vaccine had ever been approved before was 4 years. Here, regulators had to operate at speed. And one quick example, we ran short of vaccines. Britain was one of the first off the mark. We were getting the vaccines, producing them. We ran short. Vaccines minister said, Karen, can you help? I contacted the Poonawallas. Their factory was still not authorized by the MHRA, our regulator in the UK. They flew out within days. They authorized the plant, and we brought over 5 million of those vaccines. So we've shown that regulation now can be dynamic and quick. So these are some of the benefits that have come out of this pandemic, is operating at real speed, but collaborating at speed as well.
I just want to follow up on the point that you made there about this factor. If I can ask, what is it precisely that makes this vaccine producer so effective that we can learn in the global north? What is that ingredient that needs to be taken up here?
You know what it is? Entrepreneurship. And you know what the best ingredient for entrepreneurship is? Guts. Because entrepreneurs have the guts to do it in the first place, and they have the guts to stick with it when others would give up. So we need that entrepreneurial spirit.
Entrepreneurial spirit, okay. Dr. Nicolaus, I want to come back to you now, because another challenge that's facing health systems around the world certainly is antimicrobial resistance. This is the so-called silent pandemic for public health worldwide. It is something that has been discussed, of course, in the global community before, but with the current pandemic has been put on the back burner in many senses. How can the G7 promote innovation to address this problem?
Yes, it is indeed a huge issue to come forward, because already now 700,000 people die every year due to the cause of non-availability of adequate antibiotics here. And this might multiply to a number which is double the death toll of COVID by the year 2050 if we are not doing anything against it. So what can we do? First of all, something you addressed, Lord Bilamura, is actually very, very important. This is everyone, all the necessary stakeholders need to work together, because what you just described, this is an ingredient for success, that you have everyone, research, development, translation, the policymakers and the industry talking to each other at one table to make sure that they are working towards a solution. Now, let me shortly also elaborate on what makes antimicrobial resistance so difficult. Because antibiotics research is something which is not economic anymore. If you develop antibiotics for microbes which are resistant, you have a tiny, tiny market. And ideally, you would have an antibiotic which you would not need to use or only rarely need to use. And therefore, it's economically not feasible for a company, for a given company, to invest in research, development, clinical trials, production, all of that. So this is why we need to have a cooperation where everyone pulls together to make sure that we have incentives in place, which makes it rewardable to be successful in antibiotic research for such reasons. That can be push systems, like actually financing, research development, or pull system to make sure that you have an income guarantee or something like that. And we are also having something very remarkable, which is the AMR Action Fund, where we have 25 pharmaceutical companies. Boehringer Ingelheim is amongst of them, I might proudly mention. And you have the biggest private-public partnership in antibiotics research to ensure that there are funds available for the small companies who dare, with entrepreneurial spirit, to research in that antibiotics which we will need in the future. And I think this is an example where we now can see and apply what we have learned during the COVID pandemic, what is needed. And of course, we also need all the regulatories to make sure that we have fast registration and all of that in place. So I think that is actually, we can just take what we have learned from COVID and apply that to this huge threat to humanity.
That's an important point for the G7 to pick up on as well. And Mr. Ohnesorger, coming back to the topic of digitalization and health data, many people said that the pandemic, of course, accelerated a lot of the steps that many countries in Europe certainly wanted to take in moving towards a more digital health system. What can the G7 do to, let's say, cash in on that progress and move forward even further?
I think it definitely raised the awareness. And I think the breakthroughs we saw in delivering healthcare and medical consultation virtually was hardly possible or an imagination before. That became now pretty normal. We now wish that also the traveling of data, the respective underlying data policies can be developed further as such, so that there can be a joint access to this health data under very secure data regulations that are actually in place, but the individual legislations of various countries, especially in Europe, makes it sometimes difficult to access. And the next dimension that the need for access to data to drive data-driven innovation is that it has to go beyond controlled study environments of a couple of hundred patients to develop a certain drug or a certain imaging algorithm or imaging technology. The next level of digital and data-driven medicine is really to, as we call it, develop digital twins of certain disease states and organs in order to make clinical decisions. And that needs access to data from the healthcare environment, from healthcare provision, rather than from controlled study environment. Because AI is about big data, and big data is about health data from health systems. And that to drive forward, to bring the best medical decision, be it in imaging, be it in pharmaceuticals, be it in therapies, that needs now this more holistic approach. And there the G7 can do a lot. I would say, especially Europe can already do a lot, the European base on G7, including best practice sharing with the other G7 countries, to set a foundation that industry, politics, and healthcare provision can work together to drive innovation. That's, we hope, a key learning and progress from what we learned during the pandemic.
Just to follow up on that, what is the biggest stumbling block, would you say, to actually harmonize data itself, even within the European Union?
The biggest stumbling block at this point for industry, we're at B7, is that there's a very rigid possibility for innovation and technology providers or industrial or industry as such to access health data. That foundation is not yet properly set, in some countries more, in others less. And there to develop a very common system of well-protected data, but in a very regulated access also for industry to drive innovation.
I saw Mr. Villamoria nodding his head there, so perhaps I'll just ask you for your comments on that point and what the G7 can do to harmonize perhaps data and innovation.
Well, I think there can be no better authority than Siemens on this matter. As Chancellor of the University of Birmingham, one of our Russell Group universities, we've just opened up a campus in Dubai, and it was in partnership with Siemens, and it's the most modern AI-enabled campus. So the power of technology is absolutely phenomenal. When it comes to data, my only worry is this, and this is a point that was brought up a year ago at the B7, which I had the privilege of chairing last year, is one of our participants, may have been somebody from Siemens, said, we're getting more and more digital, but the more digital we get, the more vulnerable we get. And that is the worrying part about this, including in the area that we're talking about.
And that would be the purview of the G7, of course, is to address some of those vulnerabilities, perhaps something they'll take up in their summit starting next week. Mr. Dulga, I'd like to come back to you because we discussed just a little while ago, I asked you about inequity. How do you think, learning from the experiences of this pandemic, challenges of health equity generally can be addressed?
Well, I think we've learned that we need better planning, that we need better logistics, more production capacities, but we also need the protection of intellectual property, that the companies who do own the technologies for vaccinations are willing to open and to roll out their technology. And I think we also, what we learned, for example, in Europe, is we need more laboratory capacities for testing, for example. That was one of the first lessons we had to learn, that not only these little paper strip tests would help, we also need to find out what kind of virus do we have, which variant do we have, and therefore we needed more lab capacities, what we didn't have. So there are a few steps to be made, and this all should be under the roof of a digitalized, at least, minimum European, if not worldwide, network that we can exchange those informations as fast as we can. For example, one of the biggest issues in the beginning of the pandemic was logistics, because we had a vaccination, but this needed to be transported with minus 70 degrees centigrade. And that was a major problem because we didn't have the capacities to make transportations with these low temperatures. All these facts and issues put together, and if we could bring in charge a commission that is collecting all these aftermath data and all the know-how we gathered, and to come out with a future plan to get to bring a future pandemic under control. This would be the lessons learned.
But I would ask you about that specific question. How can vaccine production be ramped up on a local level in the future?
Maybe we need more international investments and strategic investments in certain locations around the world. It's not it's not a national issue, it's an international issue.
I'll ask you to follow up on that, Dr. Nikolaus, because you've been nodding your head both at the question of intellectual property and ramping up vaccine production.
Not just vaccine production, ramping up production in general, that is, because we don't know what is awaiting for us in the future, right? And the same is true for antibiotics and what else. So first of all, the issue of intellectual property, I'm really a little bit disappointed about the outcomes which we just had on COVID vaccinations, because honestly, intellectual property is the bread and butter of innovators and of entrepreneurs. This is our incentive. This is why our researchers research. This is why we are doing business. This is why we are investing in research and development, because we know that we have a reliable future for a certain period of time, which is not eternity, but a certain period of time. And if the intellectual property is now further eroded, this will not help innovation across the world in the global dimension. That's what I feel very strongly about. Sorry to say that, yeah. The issue of data and what you just mentioned, that is also something which is very, very close to the heart, because all of the players need to have access to healthcare data, also the pharmaceutical industry. Because if we are talking about speeding up research, development, and bringing any therapies to market, we need to have equal access to data, of course, on an anonymized basis, that's clear, because we don't need to see data of a patient XYZ, but we also need to have access. And this is, I think, something everyone really, the G7 can really help to bring on systems where we have secure and safe access to healthcare data to together improve the speed of development of new therapies. That is something which is very close to my heart as well.
I'll ask you just a quick follow-up question on intellectual property. How do you then balance the concern that there needs to be a ramp-up of vaccine production, particularly for the Global South, with the need to protect that property?
It's not an issue of availability of enough vaccination. The vaccination is here. It's a distribution topic, and I think a distribution topic is not being solved by the intellectual property topic.
Do you agree, Mr. Villamoria?
Well, the IP, I gave you a model earlier of how the IP should work. Oxford, AstraZeneca. Oxford develops a vaccine, goes into partnership with AstraZeneca, and you license it to the Serum Institute of India to produce. There, the IP is protected. That's the model that we should have. You license out the production. If I may, just to come back to a point that was made earlier about testing, with soft power, if we talk about soft power, Britain, we pride ourselves on soft power. The three strongest elements of our soft power are, one, Her Majesty the Queen, who's just celebrated her Platinum Jubilee, 70 years. Secondly, the BBC. Over 500 million people every single day listen or watch the BBC. And the third is our Premier League football. And when the pandemic started, all football matches stopped. And I got a phone call from a company saying, look, we have got a model. We can test the players regularly, and then the Premier League can carry on and finish its season. And I introduced them to the University of Birmingham, to our professors there, and the whole Premier League carried on. If you know, around the world, we had no spectators, but it carried on using testing. So I kept pushing, and I have the advantage that I sit in the UK Parliament, in the House of Lords, as well as being president of the CBI, and I lobbied the government saying, why don't you have free lateral flow tests? They're cheap, have mass testing instead of mass isolation. I started in August 2020. The government just ignored me. They battered me off. They were sometimes rude to me, saying, no, only PCR testing. This is not accurate enough. I said, do you want the best to be the enemy of the good? If you have regular lateral flow testing, isolate those people. Everyone else carries on with school, carries on with university, carries on with work. You don't have to have lockdowns. Eventually, they listened to me in November. It's in Parliament, and as an entrepreneur, you never give up. I asked the question again, and the health minister said, Lord Bilimoria, you have won this argument, and we're inspired by you. I nearly fell off my chair. Now, they implemented, I said, you need to give it free to citizens and free to businesses. It took many, many months. But in December last year, and January this year, we ran out of lateral flow tests because people were using them so regularly. And we realized you don't need mass isolation. We could have avoided lockdowns 2 and 3 if we implemented lateral flow testing earlier. So the armory that we have going forward, we've got the vaccines, we've got mass lateral flow testing, and another thing we called out for going back to January last year was antivirals and treatments. We now have antivirals that are very effective as well. So this is, I'm giving a lecture in Oxford day after tomorrow at the business school there on the lessons I've learned being president of the leading business organization in the UK. And one of the themes is problem, solution, action. And we, as the leading business community, we spot the problems earlier than government. We tell the solutions quicker than government, and we want to act quickly. And if you can get government to collaborate on all 3 of those steps, that's the real power in all of us making a real difference in our own countries and around the world.
I have to come back, though, to that question about intellectual property, because the recent WTO compromise on the TRIPS agreement, do you think that intellectual property will be maintained for medical devices going forward?
The requirement, I mean, at the moment we're negotiating free trade deals. For example, in the UK, we've just signed one with Australia, with New Zealand. We're in the midst of negotiating one with India. And I know the European Union has for a long time been talking about a free trade deal with India, which might be imminent as well. And IP definitely plays a part there. There's no running away from it. We have to address it head on. And again, India, the academics in India, we want to collaborate with those academics to create IP to both our countries' benefits and to the EU's benefit as well.
Thank you for that answer. Mr. Ohnesorger, something we haven't discussed yet is communication with healthcare systems and vaccine campaigns, which is something that was heavily criticized in many countries on the way certain campaigns worked or did not work in inspiring people to get shots in arms, because people do have to show up at the vaccination centers, of course. What is the role for education here? What can the G7 do better? What have they learned from this pandemic?
Let me actually first add just one sentence to the IP discussion. I mean, because you asked about medical devices, we definitely expect that IP remains protected for both pharma and medical devices. And the solution is what Lord Billimore said. I mean, to collaborate and to understand a scale. I mean, affordability comes with scale, and affordability comes with understanding local needs. And to co-create, innovate with the respective underserved, underdeveloped markets so that the affordability challenge can be tackled in a more direct and cooperative way rather than a take-away IP way. At least that's my personal position. On the communication, that's and to get a population on board, I think this is very, very important in healthcare as such. I will add one topic to what Lord Billimore said. There's one thing that probably Germany did faster than others. That was the testing regime, probably because of the knowing crisis that the vaccine rollout will take much longer than in other countries to the lack of digitalization and the lack of onboarding and communication to the population. So that's why I try to close the loop on it. I think the communication, be it in terms of vaccination, be it in terms of access to medical technology, be it in terms of providing, motivating patients, people to providing access to their health data. So I come back to the original topic as well, needs a constant dialogue of the benefit. I mean, the more there is pressure and you need legislation and you have to, I mean, there is resistance. The consequent communication of the benefit and the alternatives that might not always be there, while obviously always having a protection or an understanding of that there is a human right of personal decisions for own health. To be very open about consequences, benefits is key. And I think this is has probably too slow started, and we see it across the board. We saw it in the vaccine basically regime. We do see it in motivating patients to opt into electronic health records. We do see it in providing their data for the purpose of research or even industry innovation. So I can only say it is super important. It should be very patient and people-centric. Respective interest groups of patient interest groups should be coming more to the table and being involved in these discussions. And there, I believe that G7 can play a very important role together with all other stakeholders, the WHO, because the same discussion on communication has to take place also with the non-G7 countries, where access to healthcare is as important as to the G7 countries.
Mr. Dilga, I'd be curious to get your perspective on this as well. How communication can improve for future pandemics. From your association's perspective, what do you think could be better there that the G7 could integrate, as Mr. Ohnesorger just said?
Well, before I say a few words about communication, I would like to line out what important role the entrepreneurs and the enterprises and the companies in our countries played in getting the pandemic under control. What we did in our companies, in mine, in yours, what all the big companies in Germany and Europe did for their employees to protect them and to protect their families, provide testing, provide masks, just make it possible for them to come to work every day, that the salaries are being paid on, that all the taxes and everything could have been paid on. And we tried as hard as we could to avoid a lockdown in industry, which we managed to do so. And I would like to line out which important role that played in getting this pandemic under control, keep the people employed, try to get rid of the lockdown, and find back into normality. So there was a very important role of us entrepreneurs, of the companies, the enterprises, their managements, and I would like to line that out, that played a really important role to manage this pandemic. And what can we learn for the future? Trust the economy and the entrepreneurs more than you did in the past. And my conclusion is that what remains under the line is that we have in the free economy been more successful than the governments ever were. So I come to the same point you did, Lord Billmoller, when it comes to sum up the results of what we have experienced so far. And when it comes to communications, I would also like to line out that we here in Germany worked very well together with our social partners, the trade unions, and our workers' councils in the company. We all worked together, we all tried to solve the problems, and it performed magnificently. So communication starts within the company. Communication starts also with the people every day sitting in their houses waiting for news what they can do to solve the problem. So communication played an important role. And I think also, again, in the companies, our communication was faster and better than anything we saw from the public hand. And then later on, the government turned around and said, yes, okay, we give more responsibility into the companies, into the entrepreneurs with the little shops with 1 or 2 employees. They were much better in managing this crisis than the whole government did before. So when it comes to communication, trust us more. This is the only thing I have to say.
More trust is needed. Okay. Well, just to wrap up our panel discussion, I'd like to go through the panel here and ask each of you to tell me what you think the biggest priority is for the healthcare industry that you could pass on to G7 leaders as they're set to meet next week. What would you say is the biggest priority looking forward to future pandemics, but other challenges in healthcare as well?
I would say keep the dialogue alive with all the stakeholders we need to manage a good healthcare system. All parts, which is the research, the development, the universities, the industry, and the policymakers to make sure that we are communicating with each other. I give you an example, and exactly what Mr. Dulger said. In the beginning, we said, listen, we can vaccinate our people. We know how to do that. Just give us the vaccination and we do it. But nobody wanted to talk with us in the beginning because we were not even part of the thinking, part of the solution. And I think this is very, very important, that we stay in contact and in good conversation with each other to ensure that everybody understands what part can each player play in the future of a good healthcare system.
Staying in communication, certainly. Mr. Villamori, what would you say would be your set of priorities?
Thank you. I think one lesson learned is you can say we all acted at speed, we all did these amazing things during the pandemic because necessity is the mother of invention. But we've shown we can do it quickly. We've got to now continue with this attitude of restless innovation. There's an anti-malarial vaccine round the corner at Oxford. Can you imagine how many lives that will save if we have it? And it's already shown to be about 75% effective. That's the sort of thing we've got to back now. And the point made about trust, that is spot on. One of our Harvard Business School professors, Francis Fry, gave a lecture on trust during the pandemic. And if I summarize a 1-hour lecture in 30 seconds, it's a triangle. To get trust, you have to be authentic. You have to have the logic, you have to have the capability to do and deliver what you're promising to do. And finally, you've got to have the empathy. And I think business, and I think Siegfried made the point earlier, in the Edelman Trust Barometer, business is the institution trusted the most in the latest report. Isn't that amazing? That's because we've shown to be authentic, we've shown to have the capability, and we care. We're empathetic as well.
Mr. Onnesberger.
I would say carefully study the B7 health paper. It has been amazing of how in 8 pages, in a very short period of time, globally, all the knowledge was assembled, what to learn from this pandemic and how to apply it to healthcare systems globally. It's about investing in the health system, making them more resilient, and making them more digital, enabling an ecosystem of innovation, and enabling to resolve healthcare inequities in both prevention, diagnosis, and also treatment. And this is very nicely outlined. And the pandemic is one thing that taught us a big lesson, or big lessons. There's going to be a next pandemic, potentially. The antibiotics challenge is ahead, but the non-communicable diseases, the world killers, are around and can benefit and shall benefit from the same logics.
Okay. Finally, Mr. Dulger.
I think everything has been said, not everyone has been talking. I just can outline what my neighbors said before. Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you all very much for this interesting discussion. I think there's certainly some points to be taken up at the G7 on how we all can be better prepared for future pandemics. So I invite you to take your seats again. Thank you.